Welcome to this presentation which details the assessment rubric used for Criteria 3. When reviewing your folios come SAT assessment time, Criteria 3, which is worth 10 marks, is used to assess how well you've used the design process and design thinking to generate, develop and refine a range of annotated concepts relevant to the brief. Here is the assessment rubric for Criteria 3. And we can see the Criteria 3 description on the far left, and from left to right we can see the levels of performance columns and the descriptions explaining in detail the award for the mark. Criteria 3 is marked out of 10 and there are 5 possible performance levels within this, from very low to very high. Now there's a copy of this on the course website under Resources, Unit 4 Assessment, SAT Assessment. So I reckon it's a really good idea to print these out. So for Criteria 3, what are we looking at? Well, I'm concerned with how well you demonstrate the design process and communicate your design thinking for each presentation. This will be evident in your idea generation folio pages, your design development folio pages, and your design refinement folio pages. So let's have a look at the design process first. Now you learnt about the design process in Unit 3 and you looked at how different fields of design use this process with all those different little mini design briefs you did. You also started to work through the process yourself in Unit 3, Outcome 3, when you started working on your SAT. That is, when you were writing your design brief, you carried out some research and you started generating ideas. Now these first steps need to be completed before the next step, which is the development of concepts. The design process does not follow a straight line. Keep in mind that the design process is cyclical or iterative, with stages revisited as required to resolve design problems and extend ideas. So often when you run out of ideas or you get a bit stuck, you can go back to research and have a look at maybe some new images or images you've already seen, and you might see things a bit differently, or you go back to your generation of ideas. So in that way it's not just a straightforward line. Now you need 2 folios, each with the design brief pasted in the front, and the design process work needs to follow. A low score will result if you don't show evidence of 2 separate design processes, that is, 1 for each folio. Now let's have a look at developing concepts. So this stage requires selecting preferred ideas, which you started generating in idea generation process, and applying a range of methods, media, materials, different design elements, different design principles, and trying different presentation formats to create 2- and 3-dimensional visual communications that address the brief. Both visualization and presentation drawing methods are relevant to this stage. You'll be working on this stage for several weeks before moving on to the refinement stage and final presentations. So let's have a look at annotations. As explained earlier in Unit 3, all your development work during the design process needs to be annotated. Ideally, annotations are handwritten. However, they can be typed if that's appropriate at the time, such as those you've done on Pinterest, and some of you have typed them up on Word, and that's fine. Annotations are placed next to or on top of your work. They are written as you go in real time, not retrospectively, and they reflect your reasoning. They help you to remember why you made certain decisions and communicate this reasoning to the client. They are going to help you with your pitch as well, which we'll get into the next presentation. Now here are some hints. You can use arrows to point to the aspect that you're referring to assist with clarity. Wherever possible, use the language of design elements and design principles, and indicate any materials, media or methods that are intended to be used. Now above I've shown you an example of development work done by a top design student called Ella Fenton, and this was presented at this year's Top Designs. So let's look closely now at the example that's done by Ella. Her folio page before shows exploration of different 3D forms which she created in the material of clay. She's then taken photos, printed them out, arranged them on the page, and then included her handwritten annotations. Now let's read one here. It says, "This elongated, simple form has a strong connection to what the design brief is wanting. With an organic feel, it still requires more interest, but alone is a very appealing form." Now she's used the language of the design elements here with the word form, and she's used pretty descriptive words and adjectives using words like organic, elongated and simplistic. So if you could do something like this, that would be fantastic. Now let's go into a bit more detail with how to use the language of the design elements and design principles. Here's an example. Cross-hatching of lines creates shadows. The organic shapes of the foliage provide a contrast to the geometric shapes of the building, and I've highlighted the design elements or design principles here. The sharp, straight, bright yellow line over the grey image contributes to creating a focus point. So let's move on to how you're going to demonstrate your design thinking. So first we have to look at some of the thinking strategies that are employed. So you're going to tease out the best ideas suited to each of the presentation formats outlined in your design brief. And this involves 3 different design thinking strategies. That's creative thinking, critical thinking, and reflective thinking. So let's go back to creative thinking, and that requires a curious, open-minded, flexible, divergent, explorative, and investigative approach. Critical thinking requires questioning, clarifying, planning, analysing, examining, and testing of information and ideas. And reflective thinking requires a metacognitive approach, and metacognitive means thinking about your thinking. It's seeking and considering feedback and reflecting on your progress and processes and making links and connections with broader issues and the work of other designers. These types of thinking and the terminology used above are defined in more detail and in the context of visual communication as follows. And it's applied throughout the process. So let's have a look at creative thinking in a bit more detail. Here's an example of a mind map, which is a very visual way to express creative thinking. Creative thinking is curious. That means you look at things with a questioning eye and you're eager to learn. It's open-minded. That's being receptive to new ideas, keeping the mind open and looking further for an explanation, accepting that things may not always be as they seem at first glance. Creative thinking is flexible. That means it requires adaptability, being prepared to make allowances and being open to persuasion. Creative thinking is divergent, and that's sometimes known as lateral thinking, which you may have heard of, which means creating many different possible solutions, diverging from the expected train of thought or from obvious ideas. Most of the work you've completed so far in the generation of ideas stage could be considered divergent thinking, and it's assessed largely by assessment criteria 2, which we looked at last week, which is how you use your observational and visualization drawings to generate ideas relevant to the brief, because we're always trying to get you to be original. Creative thinking is also explorative. That means going a step further in trying something out and moving into unfamiliar or new areas. And creative thinking finally is investigative. Gee, that's hard to say. And that means finding out more. Okay, now let's look at critical thinking, which is, some people think it's the opposite of creative thinking, but the two of them have to work together. And here is an example of convergent thinking, which we'll get to in a minute. But let's have a look first at some of the aspects of critical thinking. That's questioning. That means asking why and what is the purpose. Going back to your design brief, you ask things like, is this necessary? Is it acceptable? And how can it be improved? What are the positives and the negatives? Where can this be achieved? clarifying, which means making things clear, and here annotations will really help you so that you can further explain your ideas if they're not that obvious in the sketch. Critical thinking involves planning, so that means looking ahead, deciding what will be needed and how you need to achieve it. Critical thinking involves analysis, and that means looking at things in detail, often according to criteria. And finally, critical thinking is examining and testing information and ideas, bringing things into a realistic perspective. Now, critical thinking is often the stage before convergent thinking, and that's what this little diagram here shows. And convergent thinking is pretty much the opposite of divergent thinking, which was in the previous slide. Convergent thinking is that which brings the ideas to a more defined solution. And you can see up here in the diagram the squiggly, curvy, zigzag and coloured lines, all with different trains of thought, and these eventually are leading to a convergent thought, which is represented by the yellow box with a tick. Now, finally, let's look at reflective thinking. So, the first aspect of that is the metacognition, which means knowing your own mind, knowing your limits, knowing how you learn and working out what works best for you and the situation by adapting sources, time, learning activities to suit. So, I've had conversations with some of you already looking at what your strengths are and what you're good at, and really trying to tease those out and giving you a chance to best show what your strengths are. The other aspect of reflective thinking is about seeking and considering feedback. So it means asking others for their opinion. Now, you're all sending in work to me to mark, which is great, but I also think there's merit in asking other people, your friends, maybe parents, maybe other teachers, maybe showing them some of your ideas and seeing what they think. You'd be surprised. Sometimes people have new ways of looking at things and they can really help you. Reflective thinking also involves reflecting on your progress and processes. So that means constantly looking at what has been completed already, flipping through your folio pages and checking the direction you're going in. It also means making links and connections with broader issues in society and even the work of others, other artists, other designers. It means being interested in both historical and current designers and their work and comparing one's own approach with these. It also means being interested in aspects of current daily life or, the times we live in, bringing an up-to-date and relevance to any work produced. So, pull in all the references that you have around you, things that you're interested in, music, street art, all that type of stuff is all really important in making links and connections with your work. And finally, if you need help with any design thinking strategies, there are things you can do. There's the 6 thinking hats, there's mind maps, graphic organisers, and I've just left a little web address there for you, so you can have a look at that and see what some of those little tools are. Now, this presentation is going to be is on the website too as a PDF, so you can download it and sort of read it again at your leisure, print it out if you need to as well. I hope that's made sense.